Our beer of the week this week is Jacko. It's the Sam Adams Pumpkin Ale. Thought we should get a pumpkin kind of beer since we're approaching Halloween, mix it up a little bit, and it's a pretty good one.
My name's Steven. I'm your host with Perfect Takes, joined by my co host, Jacob. We have another guest for the second consecutive week. His name is Dylan Jackson. He's worked with the Hornets fan side, he's an affiliate for them, and he has previous experience with Pro Football Focus, which we've actually had a previous intern with last week with Tage Seth. So kind of small world there. Is there anything else you kind of want us to know about you, Dylan, as we before we jump into the podcast?
Yeah, every Saturday, Sunday, I'm on the sofa watching football. That's kind of all you need to know, I guess, right?
That's all you need.
Oh yeah, we're big couch potatoes, especially Sunday afternoon. And one thing that wasn't really all that great was probably the second quarter on in that Panthers game. Jumping out the 14-0 was really special. I almost thought for a brief stint that we had a chance on Sunday.
Yeah, we had the nice new blue uniforms, the processed blues, and we got that 14-0 lead. I think we held them to three and outs the first couple of drives. And you're right. There's in the back of my mind, I was like, man, we can get this done. And then it obviously all fell apart. They score, I believe, 35 unanswered points before we got a pick six on their backup QB, and then they scored again, and just didn't end well. But it was a promising start. I'll say that.
Yeah, I think at this point in the season, I think my main takeaway is just going to be how well does Bryce Young play, right? Being 0-6 at this point in the year, I don't really think that anything else matters. You can kind of point to coaching, you can have some, takeaways about the defense, but at the end of the day, all that's really going to be remembered from this is how well does Bryce Young play. And I think it was his best game so far this year. You know, I believe the first drive was like a three and out, but after that, like the next two drives, right? It was nice, long, methodical drives down the field. Chuba looked really good. Bryce had this one throw to Adam Thielen on that first drive where Adam Thielen was kind of like crossing over the field. He stepped up into pressure, hit a really nice throw to Thielen in stride for a nice like 20 something yard gain. And then later he hit Thielen on like a 14-yard touchdown, something like that. And that was also a really nice throw. But in general, I think that it was by far his best start of the season, at least so far. And I think that it's going to be really promising to build on, even though this team did lose by 21 points. That's kind of like what I'm really looking for each and every game from now till the end of the season, really.
Yeah, I think he's improved steadily throughout the year, but like you said, this was definitely his best start. The throw over the middle to Thielen, like you were talking about, he threw the ball when Thielen was behind the linebacker that was covering that middle zone, and it still got to him, and he got that big gain. That's the anticipation that I thought we would see a bit more, like bit more early and often, but glad it's clicking now. And the touchdown to Thielen was that was a beauty. Like right, I believe it tipped the defender's hands just barely, but right over him to where he couldn't disrupt it and hit Thielen. And it's good that those two have a good rapport. I know a lot of people, myself included, kind of question the payment for Thielen, but he's performed pretty well early this year, and hopefully he can get 1,000 yards and help get that rapport with Bryce and help him grow throughout the rest of the year.
I agree with a lot of the points you guys just made. Bryce, I think the whole reason why we drafted him out of Alabama is because he has that ability to just make plays and have that anticipation. And that's what he showed on Sunday. And I think a lot of that goes back to kind of what the coaching staff alluded to last week before the game is that they were taking more off Bryce's plate so he could just play football. Similarly, what we've seen CJ Stroud and Anthony Richardson do so far up into this point. So it was nice to just see those glimpses from him and what he can become kind of in this offense and with this team. But it goes back to the coaching point is that we bring in supposedly an all-star coaching staff and they don't have the training wheels on our first overall pick. That to me it blows my mind. To me it's not it's poor management, top to bottom.
We've harped on the coaching staff, particularly the offensive side, like every week we've done this pod. But I think we kind of need to shed a little more light on the defensive side of the ball. I know they're hampered by a lot of injuries, but the defense has been gashed all year pretty consistently, especially in the run game. I mean, Raheem Mostert, who we'll talk about later in the best performances segment, he tore us up. Their back, it was Savon Ahmed. He tore us up too. I'm sure if Devon HN played, he would have had another nuclear game. The defense is just a bit disappointing, I think, especially with Evero coming over and the pedigree he had. Talked about that last week with Tage, where they had one of the better schemes last year, and it's just not coming together this year. And I would say a lot of it is on the personnel, but some of it has to be on the scheme.
Yeah, defensively, I mean, there's really just the personnel hasn't quite been there with J.C. Horn being out, with Shaq Thompson being out. I think a lot of the players that have been playing have been extremely underwhelming, especially if you look at it from like a long term lens. If you look at these corners, Dante Jackson, C.J.
Mhm.
Henderson, they've been extremely underwhelming not only this year but throughout their entire careers. Derek Brown, I know it's like not all on him. I think he played, I guess, like a decent game. But you know, when you draft a defensive tackle like him within the top 10, you would hope that the run defense, especially inside, is at least a little bit better. And I know it's not all on him because the complementary inside defensive linemen have been horrendous this year for Carolina. They've had like just some like Madden creative players out there right next to him. You know. Um, it's really just it's been quite disappointing, and I do feel for the defense in some regard because a lot of what they've done this year they've been put in pretty bad positions. I thought they had a pretty good start to the year against Atlanta, against New Orleans, and a lot of it, you know, you go back to like the Minnesota game, like they the offense, you know, had a turnover that ended up being 6 points, right? So I think that, you know, considering like the injuries, considering the past two teams that they've played against, it's been like not as horrendous, but it's still not where you want to be, giving up 40 plus points in the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, it's super disappointing. And like you said, I think Derek Brown, outside of maybe the last two games, has been outstanding this year. But he's had to do everything on that interior defensive line. It's mainly just him and Burns up front, and then, like you said, C.J. Henderson and 26 in the back. I'll say this: C.J. Henderson, I think, has played better this season than he did last season, but still not a top 10 pick talent or top 10 performance, I'd say. And then like JC not being on the field is super disappointing too. But yeah, Dante with this game, I don't want to talk too much about him. He just did not have his best game this past game.
Well, I mean, I think you're I don't want to harp on Dylan's point too much here, but there's an element of there's only so much you can do with what's in the cupboard. And we talked about it going into the season. The defensive line, especially the interior of it, was very thin. I mean, we're talking about outside of Derek Brown, you have Shy Tuttle and Deshaun Williams. And Derek Brown, like we're talking about, can only do so much. Xavier Woods and Von Bell, and we've had obviously Horn out, and so you have most of your secondary banged up. You get a core leader in Shaq Thompson who helps with setting guys and calling out some of those plays. And when you lose all of that, it starts deteriorating what you can do on the defensive side. And this is a defense that held Kirk Cousins to what, under 200 passing yards, and it
Hmm.
forced 2 3 and outs to start this game. So it's not like they aren't pitching in and trying to do their part. There's just only so much you can do when you have this much talent on that back end. And Dante Jackson and CJ Henderson are not starters in this NFL today. They're backups at best.
I agree. On a positive note, I think our player of the game, at least for me, was Bryce. He had a mistake-free game, threw with anticipation, was able to make across the middle of the field throws, just everything we wanted to see. And like we've been talking about, he has that connection with Thielen. Hopefully, with the new play caller change and stuff like that after the bye, which we'll talk about a bit later, he'll be able to. It'll open up more, and he'll be able to connect with other receivers. But I thought he had probably the best game of his career, and I think this is a good time for us to have a bye week. 0-6 is it's just bad, kind of unacceptable with the coaching staff and the moves that were made in the offseason with the front office, Scott Fitterer in particular saying this is the time we can make a run at the NFC South where we've built the defense, we've built the offensive line, we can just drop a QB in and go. That just hasn't been the case so far, but moving forward after the bye week, hopefully we can gain some traction.
And newsflash, everybody else in the NFC South is 3-3 right now. Like, and we don't have a win to our name. Like, what? Like, this is like they set standards coming into the season. Like, this wasn't something like the media was blowing up. This is something, like you said, was coming from Fitterer, was coming from Reich. We feel like we can be a contender in the NFC South, which they might have believed at the time, but clearly it's not adding up with the talent on the field.
A
So,
tweet.
so I just kind of want to make a point here, just on Scott Fitterer, and I know that we can attribute a lot of the personnel moves to Matt Rule as well from 2021. But when you look at all the draft picks that this regime has made, they had like 11 so picks in 2021. They had like 6 picks last year. They had 5 picks this year. If you look outside of Bryce Young, which I don't know if you can totally credit Scott Fitterer for that pick yet, um, what above average player has he drafted with any of those picks? Like JC Horn, maybe, sure. But at the end of the day, he hasn't even played like a full season yet. Um,
Exactly.
Ikem Ekwonu, he had a pretty great rookie year last year. But how has he looked this year? Like not good, right? So if you look at all of these different draft picks, like Terrace Marshall in the second round, Brady Christensen in the third, Tommy Tremble in the third, um, there's like no day three guys whatsoever in any of these three draft classes that you can consider honestly even rotational at this point. So I mean maybe like Caden Mays, but we've seen how he's performed too. So like what draft pick does he have to kind of hang his hat on, that he can say that he hit on outside of the first overall pick, who we're not even sure is going to be that guy quite yet?
Absolutely. Like I said, we'll talk more about Fitterer and kind of his shortcomings later, but you're making a great point. The best pick during his tenure was allegedly made by Matt Rule's wife and Chuba Hubbard. I mean, J.C. Horn and Icky and Bryce, first rounders. So I'll say like, they're kind of there. You kind of have to take those caliber guys. So I don't want to credit him with a ton of success there. And even then, like you said, J.C. Horn hasn't played a full season. Icky, great run blocker last year, kind of okay pass blocker, has regressed on both fronts this year, especially in this
I
Dolphins
mean,
game.
so here's the thing with like the JC Horn pick too is, I mean, look at like the 5 picks after him,
Hmm.
right? Like
Mm-hmm.
Sertan, Devontae Smith, Micah Parsons, Rashawn Slater. Those are all Pro Bowl guys, right? And they actually play.
Yeah,
So
And would fill positions of need on our roster. Like that's the crazy part is like, and you go back to the Herney days prior to Fitterer taking over. At least he hit in the first round. Like we're talking Brian Burns, we're talking Derek Brown. Like yeah, he couldn't draft uh, for a lick of anything in the day 2, day 3 picks, but he could at least hit in the first round, and we aren't getting production there.
yeah, neither can Scott Fitterer. Apparently, can't hit in those days either, which it kind of begs the question, like, if we and I don't want to keep saying we'll talk about this later, but like trading draft picks. I know a lot of fans aren't super big fans of that. I'm not either, just by the idea that you should always have more darts to throw at the board. But if he's the one throwing the darts, it might make sense to trade picks for more proven players. But we'll get to that a little bit later. Let's broaden our focus to around the NFL. I like to pick one or two games per each person to talk about this past week. And I know Dylan, you had a game between two teams wearing green. It looks like.
yeah, the Eagles and the Jets. The Jets got the win 20-14 against the Eagles, who blew a 14-3 lead. And I thought it was an interesting game because it kind of summed up a lot of my thoughts about both of these teams, and it kind of exemplified both of them. First of all, the Eagles quite simply haven't looked as impressive as they have in previous years. They're 5-1. This is their first loss of the year, but they really haven't like blown teams out of the water, and they haven't played like an overly impressive schedule yet either. And they've kind of won by winning in a bunch of different ways, with their running game in some games, with their passing game in others, and their defense has won them games as well. I think that team is quite honestly too talented to fail. Like there's no way that team is not going to be like a top 3 seed in the NFC, unless the Cowboys overtake them in the division. But they really like, haven't looked as their 5-1 record says. Maybe it's Brian Johnson, their play caller. Maybe it's kind of Hurts getting used to him a little bit more. Um, but they haven't looked like that 5-1 record, and it's going to be really worrisome coming up here. Their next like 6 games all are like going to be very very tough, right? They play at home against Miami this week, right? We know the juggernaut that Miami has become. After that, they're going to play at Washington, who took them to overtime in Philadelphia a few weeks ago. Then they're going to play Dallas, Kansas City, Buffalo, San Francisco, Dallas again, and then they have to travel to Seattle after all of that. That is one of the toughest stretches I think I've ever seen the schedule makers give one particular team, right? Like that is just like juggernaut after juggernaut. And I think you could see the Eagles maybe like after that stretch be like 7-5 or something of that nature. So they're going to be a team to watch, and I think the Jets have kind of gone a little bit under the radar this year just because of how good their defense has been. They didn't have Sauce Gardner. They didn't have their other starting corner. His name is leaving my mind at the moment, but
Is
to
it
me,
DJ Reed?
DJ Reed, I think that's right. He's really good too. By the way, he's a phenomenal second corner. Um, I think if the Jets can kind of find a way to get the ball in the hands of their playmakers, most notably Garrett Wilson and Brees Hall, if those two can get like a combined like 25, 30 touches a game, I think that's really going to be key to whether they have any offensive success. I think Zach Wilson has looked improved upon last year. With that said, he's still like probably the 28th or 29th best starting quarterback in the NFL, right? Like he's not quite that guy, but if he can do like just enough, right? Just enough to get the ball in the hands of those guys, um, if they're going to be like a run first team, and I know they just lost their starting guard Elijah Vera Tucker as well, but if they can get the ball to those guys offensively, if they can continue to shut these teams down on defense, hold the Chiefs to like 23 points, right? Hold the Eagles to 14 points. I think that it's going to become a theme where if they're not winning these games, then they're at least keeping their offense in the games. And they're going to walk away at the end of the year slightly above or at 500, I would think.
I
Absolutely.
absolutely agree. This was the sorry, Steve.
You're
Let me
good.
get in real quick on this one. This was the first time the Jets have ever beaten the Eagles in a regular season or postseason game. And in large part, it was due to their defense, which kind of smothered the Eagles. Forced, what was it? I think it was 3 turnovers from Jalen Hurts. Um, yeah, it was 3, yeah. And like you're saying, Zach Wilson, this is exactly what I said on the pod last week with Tage. It was that he just needs to be like the 25th through 29th best QB and not be the worst QB in the league. Be a bad QB that can manage the game and get the ball to the playmakers. That's exactly what he's been doing. And looking at that schedule, it kind of reminds me of a discussion we had last year, Steve, with the Eagles. I know both of us picked them to go pretty far. You picked them to the Super Bowl and got that one right. And a big part of that was they had an easy schedule last year. And so far this year, they've had an easy schedule. And now that they're hitting the buzzsaw that's coming up that Dylan just read off, I wonder if it's going to be a bit different, especially with the new coordinators in Johnson and Desai on the defensive side of the ball.
So I think these are great points that are getting brought up. I want to give a lot of credit right now because what the Jets have done to start this season, especially with Aaron Rodgers being hurt and having to lean back on Zach Wilson, is they're able to get after the quarterback. And they have built their defensive line to where they can get after you, attack you, stop the run, make life absolute hell for the quarterback. And when Lane Johnson went down on Sunday, that Eagles offense seemed to collapse from there. They didn't know what to do. Jalen Hurts, he's not necessarily the fastest processor, and when he needs time to kind of be able to break down what the defense is giving him, he's not going to get that with an injured right tackle. Now, when I'm looking at the schedule, Miami, Washington, those 2 games, I think that they can kind of figure out with Lane Johnson kind of recovering. Hey, how can we give a little bit extra protection to the right side, open things up in the passing game? We just saw Bryce Young dismantle this Miami Dolphins defense that has been tortured throughout this entire entire year. It started with the Chargers week 1, and it's led up to what we've seen now. And so with some of that stuff, they might be able to win a couple of those games. I think Dallas, Kansas City, Buffalo, San Francisco, depending on the health of their team, that 4-game stretch, if you come at that 0-4, you're definitely looking at probably a wild card spot, because I think Dallas would overtake kind of the division lead and probably win the division from there on out.
Yeah, and then they have Dallas again. So it's a 5-game stretch there, which is just rough.
You mentioned that Jets pass rush, and I do agree with you with how they've built it, and just the volume of like pass rushers and different types of guys that they can throw at you. Whether it's like Jonathan Franklin Myers, who looks really good, Quinton Williams, obviously up front,
Second
Jermaine
year guy.
Johnson,
Yep. Second year guy, Jermaine Johnson, stud.
Carl Lawson, and they drafted Will McDonald like top 15 this year too. So they have so many different guys and different ways that they can attack, your pass blockers. So I really do think that's a great point to make. And I think that, that type of pass rush combined with a DJ Reed and Sauce Gardner secondary, it's hard to beat any sort of defense that has elite corners and elite pass rush.
I mean, they took the
Absolutely.
Bills and Kansas City, both of those teams on Sunday Night Football down to the wire. And like, that's exciting to see. Like, this is a defense built to stop some of these AFC powerhouses that we're seeing. And I think that could go a long way, that if Aaron Rodgers comes back December, January off this Achilles injury, that this could be a legitimate Super Bowl contender.
On the we talked about the Eagles schedule. On the flip side, the Jets are on a bye week this week, but then they get the Giants, the Chargers, the Raiders. So 3 kind of manageable games there. Then they do have Bills, Dolphins, 2 tough division games, but then it's Falcons and Texans. So their 7-game stretch kind of on the inverse of the Eagles' next 7-game stretch, way easier, and they're going to be able to gain ground, especially with their defense playing well. They're 3-3 right now, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so they could be looking at a above 500 record following that following the bye week in that 7-game stretch there. So down the line, this should be a team that's able to compete for a wild card berth there towards the end of the season. Now, another team with a pretty good D line. It doesn't have the embarrassment of riches that the Jets have, or the Eagles have for that matter. Their D line is disgusting as well. But the Titans, they played the Baltimore Ravens in London this week. I think this was our third or fourth straight London game week. And this was another kind of meh offensive game from the Ravens. I believe they had, what was it? It was 24 points at the end of the game, right? And 6 of those, believe they had 6 field goals that game. Just a kind of a slog. 24 points. Kind of a slog for the Ravens this game. They were able to bounce back and get the win, even though like the previous week they weren't dominating, but they should have gotten the win there. It was good that they were able to get the win, but they didn't really put the Titans away. They were able to make noise with Derrick Henry towards the end of the first half, but then Tannehill did get injured again, and we had to see, not we had to see, but Malik Willis came in and finished the game for him. So kind of these another 2 teams going in kind of opposite directions. I think the Ravens are trending up. Granted, they were already a good team, and as long as Lamar can get on the same page as his receivers, and with the new coordinator Todd Monken, which is something we talked about last week, that should be a team running for the division title. But the Titans are kind of going backwards. This is looking a lot like last year, where Tannehill gets hurt early, and then the offense is just real bad throughout the rest of the season. Hopefully, we're able to see something since they brought in DeAndre Hopkins and drafted Ty Spears, who is just phenomenal to watch. But it's not looking great for the Titans moving forward if they can't get a ton of offensive production.
Tajay Spears, it was an interesting fantasy stat, but it was like the first 58 minutes. I don't think he had a single touch or a single reception. And then the reception he does get, he got 48 yards on it, and it was more than any other Titans receiver had in that game. And like, that was just like mind blowing that like Tajay Spears, like in a matter of a second, was able to kind of add some juice. And that's something that you want to see in this Titans offense, because right now their offensive line isn't giving their quarterbacks any sort of protection. That's why Ryan Tannehill's out. It's why Malik Willis, when he came in, he took 4 sacks in the time he was there. And Will Levis had a awful pressure the sack ratio when he was in Kentucky. So none of those things are boding well for the guys who are going to be taking snaps at quarterback in Tennessee. But like you said, on the Baltimore side, there's a lot to love. And it starts with Todd Monken. That offense is starting to kind of gel a little bit. They're hitting their receivers. The receivers weren't dropping passes like they were against Pittsburgh. So they were able to kind of get some momentum there. There was a point you brought up that they're kicking a lot of field goals. And when you're in the red zone, I think coming into the day, they were the third best red zone team and they kicked like 5 field goals. So it's like one of those things that you need to capitalize in those instances, because if you get stymied against a Kansas City or a Jacksonville who have some decent defensive performances and will continue to do so over the course of the year, if you can't do that against them. If you want to win the big game, you want to kind of push for a Super Bowl berth, those are the kind of things you can't allow in the red zone. You need to put it in for six. Three isn't going to cut it.
I really like watching Zay Flowers. I think he's going to be a very good receiver for a long time. And he had 6 catches for 50 yards and a touchdown in this game. Not the most impressive performance. His longest catch was for like 14 yards, something like that. Um, from the Titans' perspective, I think they're kind of getting to the point where they're at the bottom of the league in terms of watchability. They're not very fun. Like I Ty Spears is awesome. He's like you said, like just super electric. I don't think DeAndre Hopkins is what he once was in Houston and in Arizona. And there's not really like any other receivers on this Titans team that's like currently playing. I know Traylon Burks is hurt at the moment. That can really salvage like that passing attack. And Ryan Tannehill really, when he has been playing this year, he hasn't looked overly impressive. I know he's been on the decline the past few years, but has still been like a solid starting level quarterback. But I know before this game there were still some whispers of if Malik Willis might get some action soon, and with Ryan Tannehill questionable for this next week, maybe we'll see Willis actually get another start and hopefully look better than he did last year. We'll see. Um, but I mean, the Ravens are they're super fun. I think the fact that they're winning games like this, when their offense still is kind of getting set in that Todd Monken scheme, where it's still not quite like 100%, but you can kind of see the vision as to where it's going. I think it's super exciting.
I
They're
agree.
opening the
Oh,
field for a lot of these like shots. Like you saw it against Pittsburgh. Like there was no reason why they didn't have like several like 20+ yard like receptions, and by 20+ yard receptions, I mean 20+ air yards. I mean Lamar had a drop touchdown to Nelson Aguilar. Zay Flowers had a couple bombs dropped. We talked about this on last week's episode, but it's like one of those things that like if some of these things that Todd Monken's scheming up clicks, like this offense could be like very explosive come like November, December.
yeah, I agree with the point you're making about Zay Flowers. I know that's one of Steve's favorite players. He was my favorite receiver coming out of the draft. Just super fun to watch. I think the interesting thing about the Titans is that they have Malik Willis playing as the back, should be the starter this week if Tannehill's still injured. But the new regime drafted Will Levis with the 32nd pick. I know it was a second rounder technically, but a top 32 pick. So the thing there is like what's going to happen there moving forward? If Tannehill's not the future, which I believe this is the last year, or maybe next year's the last year of his contract, what's that going to look like? Is it going to be Willis? Is it going to be Levis? I think that's an interesting thing to look at going forward.
I know I'm not as high on Will Levis as some others may be, but I mean it was like a high draft pick and it was a player that they're going to be invested in moving forward. The thing that I'd be interested in, I guess they have 2 wins already, is if they do finish um, with a low enough record, whether they would be in on maybe trading up for one of these quarterbacks in the draft.
I think if they got to a point, and I think the best example of this is what the Cardinals had happen to them is that if you fall in the situation where you have like a top 3 pick and one of those quarterbacks falls to you, absolutely. Because like the Cardinals, they draft Josh Rosen at 10. That's a complete disaster. They draft Kyler at 1 the next year. So I think that's definitely something that could happen based on what we see from Malik Willis and Will Levis this year. It's just one of those things like what's going to give on that front.
Yeah, it'll be super interesting. I don't know, like obviously the quarterback's the most important piece, so if you're up there, you need to take one. But this, I don't think this roster's in a good spot to put a young quarterback in. And with the high capital invested in Levis, I'm not sure that this new, it's not new, it's like a year old regime now will be willing to do so. But if they get a top three pick, they should definitely be going for a Drake May or Caleb Williams.
Now, to wrap up the Around the NFL section, there's two games that I kind of want to highlight, and it's more the similarities. They were revenge games in a sense. The Sunday night game, you had Buffalo versus the Giants, and there was some beef afterwards between Sean McDermott and Brian Dable. But when Sean McDermott went to Buffalo, Brian Dable became his offensive coordinator, and Ken Dorsey was the quarterback's coach. So there was a lot of familiarity with the offense and defensive minds going up against each other in practice, and then the quarterback's coach kind of being in Brian Dable's ear and kind of knowing tendencies. And the game finished 14-9. The Giants had two pretty much goal line stands that got shut down and would have won the game in essence. So it's very interesting to see that like there was a lot of offensive minds that kind of fell short Sunday night, and that transpired again on Monday night with Kellen Moore and Mike McCarthy. I mean, we were expecting a lot of fireworks last night, and for a 20-17 finish with a lot of missed opportunities, I felt on both sides. There was a Michael Gallup drop in the second quarter that would have been a huge, like 30-plus yard touchdown. Justin Herbert missed Keenan Allen, I believe, late in the game. And it's some of those things where it's like you expected that explosion, and yet that familiarity, Kellen Moore being with Mike McCarthy, Dan Quinn going up against them in practice, it seemed like the defenses got the better of these offensive-minded coaches over the course of Sunday and Monday.
Yeah, I'll start with like just the Dallas Cowboys defense. I think that there's just so much talent all over that defense, and it starts and ends with Micah Parsons, right? Just what he's able to give you off the edge. I think he was just so disruptive against what the Chargers wanted to do, and it really did affect Justin Herbert. Um, Herbert obviously not as impressive as he usually is. And I think it really did affect the Chargers' ability to win down the stretch of that game. Um, I think that the Cowboys are just they're one of the most talented teams in the NFL. So their ability to go into a West Coast game like they did, and take care of business, even though it was a semi close game. I know you guys are higher on the Cowboys than most as well, but I mean their defense is just stacked from top to bottom, even without a guy like Trayvon Diggs, who is unfortunately lost for the season. But I mean, I can't speak to how good of a pass rusher like Micah Parsons is. He along with I think like two different guys, maybe like Fred Warner and Miles Garrett are I believe like the three probably best defenders in terms of like impacting wins in the NFL. I think that all three of those guys are just so phenomenal, and Micah Parsons really was able to show it.
Yeah, I think he and the rest of the Dallas defense had a pretty good game. Like you were talking about, Herbert definitely didn't have his best outing. I think the finger is still affecting him pretty heavily. I don't remember if he was wearing a splint during this game, but he was just missing throws that he normally would make. But the interesting thing to me between these two games, like you were talking about, is the defensive intensity. I want to look at the Buffalo and Giants game. Buffalo didn't score until the fourth quarter, and that Giants defense is not good. They didn't finish with a single sack that game. They did have the one turnover, but they were able to stymie the Bills throughout the game. And obviously, the Bills were able to stop the vaunted Giants offense with Tyrod Taylor and the rest of the guys there. But it's just a real defensive slugfest. And while they were lighting up the board more in the Dallas and Chargers game, I can't speak right now, that was still a defensive game as well. And it's just interesting to see the familiarity, like you were talking about, Steve, with the offensive coordinator going up against their former team and the defensive coordinator that knows them well. I wonder if that's a thing that happens kind of often when a coordinator goes up against their former team and kind of takes it on the chin because they know their tendencies.
I think that plays a role. It has to. It seemed like it echoed there. The harp on your point, Dylan. I mean, what the Cowboys have put together on defense and that whole team, the roster is stacked top to bottom. And what I want to point out is Jordan Schultz. He was reporting that Deron Bland, who's kind of been playing in Trayvon Diggs' role, you have Stephon Gilmore, who's been balling out. He had the game-winning interception. They may still look to add another secondary piece via trade coming up because they just understand, like, hey, we're going to go up against the 49ers. We're going to go up against the Eagles, and they have these star studded wide receivers. We need to be able to slow that down. So I think that would be an interesting addition as we see the trade deadline approach within the next 2 weeks.
I think that's interesting because I think Bland has been one of the more underrated corners in the league so far. He's been like pretty good. I think PFF graded him out very well the past few weeks, especially after Trayvon Diggs went down. So that is interesting to me.
Yeah, Bland had he was I believe a fifth round rookie last year. He had an excellent rookie year, 5 picks. He already has 3 interceptions this year. Really good cover corner. But like you were saying, Steve, with that report, a lot of people are thinking that Sertan might be available at the deadline, and I think that's a guy that if Dallas can add him to that defense, they'd be unstoppable. And if you're pushing for a Super Bowl, that's obviously something you should be looking at. So it'll be interesting to see who or what player they try to go after at the deadline coming up in I believe it's 2 weeks. I think the deadline's on Halloween this year.
So, speaking of defenses, starting off our best performances is another team that has really built that side of the ball, and that's the Browns defense. I mean, when you have a defensive line, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, Dylan, Micah Parsons is like one of 3 defenders that really can move a game from like a wins perspective. And the defensive line that they had, like we talked about this all off season, like the pieces they add, whether it was the trade for Zadarius Smith, signing Dalvin Tomlinson, drafting I think Siaka out of was it Baylor?
Yeah, Siaki Ika. Yeah,
And when you just start building that defensive line, especially the interior where they got gashed in the run all last year, and then they had the secondary that they had. It's just almost impossible to move the ball on them. And the San Francisco 49ers, one of the best offenses in football, found that to be the case in the dog pound on Sunday. So it was very cool to see that they were held under 20 points, especially when the 49ers have scored 30 plus all year.
I think an interesting thing looking forward for the Niners is they had some injuries in this game. I know McCaffrey got banged up with an oblique injury. I believe Trent Williams was also banged up in that game. So hard loss for them. But the Browns defense was absolutely smothering them. And like you predicted this in your take from last week that they would hold them to under 25 points, I believe. They did even better and held them under 20. And like you're saying, the first time all year that the Niners have even been held below 30. So just an absolutely dominant performance from the Browns defense.
This is I think by far the best defense in the NFL, at least right now. We talked about the Jets unit a little bit earlier. I mean, this defense is almost like a step above that,
Mm-hmm.
where they have so many different guys. Whether it's Miles Garrett. I mean, I keep thinking about that one highlight a few weeks ago where the Titans would like motion 2 tight ends and follow them.
Yes.
Yeah.
I keep thinking about that, and it's just it's insane to me that you're trying to like almost triple team a defensive end, a single player. Dalvin Tomlinson, Zadarius Smith, their linebackers have been performing very well, and their secondary as well between Greg Newsome, Denzel Ward, and like 3 different safeties between Delpit, Thornhill, and McLeod. Like they can just throw a lot of different looks at you, and you can see how it affects an offense that's just like has so many different stars: Kittle, McCaffrey, Debo, Ayuk, just a tremendous offensive line, and that I think the Browns defense is just on another level of any other team in the NFL right now.
Yeah, they're definitely one of the deeper units in the league. And another pretty deep unit in the NFL this year is the Dolphins run game. I know it seems like we talk about the Dolphins every week, and the best performance we have for them this week is Raheem Mostert. Over 100 rushing yards, 3 total touchdowns against us. I think he has the most rushing touchdowns in the league this year, and he was doing some crazy stuff. They were scheming up some crazy plays for him. I know one of the touchdowns, it was on like the far end zone. They bring him in motion and have, I believe it was Durham Smythe, the tight end, run in motion, like around. It's like he's running to the flat, and they don't throw it to him. Tua fakes it, throws it to Mostert, and they have the guy in motion coming to block, and Mostert just walks in. Some of the stuff they're able to do with their running backs and with their whole offense in general is outstanding. And like I said, we have somebody on here every week for them, and this week it was Mostert.
I I think that Mike McDaniel is just he's unbelievable as a play caller, as a coach. What he's able to do, just innovating what NFL offenses are doing throughout this season has been unbelievable. The motion, um, you mentioned that play to Mostert where they motioned the tight end over beforehand. I immediately thought of that play when you started talking about Mostert. I think Mike McDaniel is just he's on another level. I know he's always sort of at the top of your play caller ranking, Steve. So that's really all I can say about that Dolphins offense is just he's unbelievable the way he's able to scheme all of his different track stars open, whether it's Hill, Waddle, Mostert, when a chain is in him. Just so many different guys, so many different weapons, so much speed, just unbelievable separation all the time. Mostert obviously got the benefit this week, as did pretty much every other Dolphins receiver, but especially Mostert. um, yeah, I think McDaniel's is just he's unbelievable.
I was sitting down with a film analyst a couple weeks ago, and we were kind of breaking down kind of what the Dolphins are doing, and they don't trust the interior of their offensive line. They like Teron Armstead, they like a little bit of their tackle play, but that's why a lot of stuff gets pushed on the perimeter. There's a lot of this dressing pre-snap, and when you have that much speed, the defense has to honor it because if another offense, like say for instance, like the Arizona Cardinals, a very scrappy team, but if they were to come out and try to run some of those similar motions, the defense just isn't going to respect it because the speed isn't there. But in this case, like when I think it's what, like 8 or 10 of the fastest ball carriers have been Devon Achan and Tyreek Hill, and it's on one single team. It's just so many different ways to attack you and deploy. And the cool thing is I this should have been something that everybody saw coming. Like this should have been the iteration from Mike McDaniel going into his second year. He was the run game coordinator for San Francisco. Like that's what set him apart and why Kyle Shanahan kept him for so long on his staff until obviously he got hired as a head coach. And it's because he understands like how everything connects and he's able to marry the pass and the run so well together that if he's in 21 personnel, he can get a defense and a look that they don't want to be in and just murder them throughout. Like he could run it 8 straight times or he could pass it 8 straight times. He's going to get the same result, and it's beautiful to watch, honestly.
One of the leaders, if not the sole leader for Coach of the Year right now, for sure. Our last guy is another speedster, not really, but Adam Thielen, a guy that a lot of people had written off coming into this year. He had 11 receptions for 115 yards and 1 touchdown this past week. Since week 2, he has the most receptions in the NFL, the sixth most receiving yards, and the most games with 11 or more catches. Yeah, also the most wide receiver fantasy points, but that's neither here nor there. He's really created a strong rapport with Bryce Young, and it's good to see that he's still kicking at I think age 33, 34 maybe this year. He's an important piece of our passing offense, and hopefully he has many more to come.
What I really like when watching Adam Thielen is just how he's able to find like the soft spot in the zone and just find ways to get open even without the speed of Tyreek Hill per se. He's just always he's extremely crafty, just such a great route runner. Really the perfect type of weapon for a guy like Bryce Young. He's not going to be here forever, right? Even next year, he'll probably take a pretty big step back. But to have a weapon like him for a guy like Bryce Young is just so important, even if he is legitimately the only guy that creates anything resembling separation.
Which is shocking because his yards per route run, his separation last year from like analytics metric standpoint all dropped off last year. So I did not think he was going to be nearly this productive. I thought he would be a good security blanket, but this kind of production is very shocking to see. And I hope it continues because we paid him a lot of money this offseason. And to get some of that production, especially this first year, and why Bryce is learning and developing, and we have a young wide receiver in Mingo that we're trying to develop, who's a very raw prospect. Like that stuff is stuff you can lean on, especially when the wide receiver room is as thin as it is.
You talk about separation. I believe consistently week after week, he's the receiver that gets the most separation out of our guys. Now, granted, he's not like a world beater or anything, but he's the only above average to average guy in terms of separation. I know I see all those spider charts every week. I'm not sure which account on Twitter posts them, but yeah, all of our other receivers are near the bottom of the league. So it's good to have at least one guy who's able to, like you said, Dylan, find the soft spot in the zone or be able to hit an option route right to get away from his guy. It's really a really good thing for Bryce to have in his rookie year.
Hopefully, Thomas Brown will kind of have that clicking coming out of the bye. Coaches, though, who are on this hot seat that we need to talk about briefly, we'll kind of go over one of the guys from last week. Bill Belichick didn't do himself any favors losing out in the desert to a former employee of his and Josh McDaniels. So back to back losses out in Las Vegas in consecutive years. Doesn't look good for him in that regime. We talked about that. The guy that we really kind of want to get into, and a guy that probably could end up being the first guy canned. It's interesting because his defensive coordinator already got canned by the FBI. His offensive coordinator, the fans absolutely hate, but that's Matt Eberflus. Like this is a guy that got brought in that kind of changed the culture in Chicago, and it's been horrendous. It's been putrid. I know Dylan was kind of alluding to like play caller rankings, and Matt Eberflus is below Vance Joseph in that ranking, and that's hard to do. To beat out a guy like Vance Joseph, who has been absolutely abysmal, is a feat in and of itself.
Talking about your play caller ranking, I looked at the one that you put out today. Go check out Patent Analytics on Twitter and his graphics. But looking at Matt Eberflus, it was really shocking to see he was below Vance Joseph because I thought during his time with the Colts, they had decent defenses during when he and Frank Reich were there and everything. So it's interesting to see, especially with the investment in both the draft and in the free agency. They spent a ton of money in that linebacker room. It's just interesting to see how poorly the defenses are perform or the defense is performing.
Yeah, I mean, when your team goes out and trades the number one overall pick, they bring in a guy like DJ Moore. They spend money on a guy like Nate Davis, in defensive players like TJ Edwards, like Tremaine Edmonds, and this team still looks as bad as it does, if not like worse than last year in some regard. It's hard to justify bringing a coach back or even having him stay on the entire year. Um, this Bears team, outside of like a Thursday night game, has looked like the worst team in the NFL, right? Like Justin Fields has had some flashes, but nothing that would make you want to build around him for another year. This offensive line looks like the worst unit in the NFL at some points. Um, it's really just like if you look up and down their roster, like what do you have to build on? Like you have a receiver, right? You have Roshan Johnson in the backfield, a fourth round running back. You don't really have too much defensively outside of like Jalen Johnson has looked pretty good. Jaquan Brisker at some points, but even guys like Kyler Gordon, who was a second round pick last year, has looked very very bad. Um, this team is just top to bottom. You would love to see more progress from being the worst team in the NFL last year, but I'm not one to usually put too much stock into Thursday night games, especially against the Washington Commanders. So I just I'm not sold on this team. I'm not sold on Eberflus. I never really have been. Um, if things continue, which I have no reason to believe they won't continue, there's no way that he will be back at the end of this year.
And what's interesting is they have our pick as well. So if they continue like this, if we don't take a step and start performing, they're gonna have at least one of the top three picks, if not two. And from there, when you look to bring in a QB of like Drake May or Caleb Williams caliber, do you really want Matt Eberflus to be the guy there? It's like the writing's kind of on the wall for him. And like you said, Steve, I could see him being the first guy gone midseason.
I think you brought up an interesting point, Dylan, because we as Panther fans, I think, are very familiar. They beat the Washington Commanders on a short week. And I remember most Thursday night games that we had, Ron Rivera did not have our crew ready. So it's like one of those things, like, absolutely, you can look at that as like a fluke game, fluke performance, because outside of that, everything else has been putrid and awful.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at, I guess, I just I don't like Thursday night games in general. I think
Yeah.
they're just a bad idea, right? Like,
Hmm.
there's so many injuries that happen on Thursday nights. Um, it's so hard to game plan on a short week like that, especially if your name is Ron Rivera. So I think it's just the Bears got to win that week, which, good for them. But at the end of the day, they still have the first two picks at the moment. So does it really matter all that much? I don't really think so. Eberflus is just he honestly probably should have been gone after winning like 3 games last year. I've just never been a huge fan of his. Yeah, if I'm a Bears fan, like, I'm pretty much looking forward to late April.
Ron Rivera couldn't game plan very well on long weeks either, so
Very true.
I wouldn't
Very
hold him
true.
to just the Thursday games. And we have another guy here who's kind of a fringe candidate, kind of old school like Rivera. It's
What's
Mike
funny is
Vrabel.
the past. Oh, you already said his name.
No,
I was about to
oh
say
yeah.
the past two coaches were defensive, and this guy is as well. So that was the tying theme together.
Well, when we were talking during the game segment about the Titans kind of losing their QB, maybe taking a step back this year, since Vrabel, in his first year, we talked about this earlier, Steve, when he went to the AFC Championship, it's all kind of been downhill from there. And I'm interested to see with the new front office if they're willing to keep Vrabel on, if they try to get a new QB, if they think Will Levis is the future. It's just an interesting thing because they haven't had success much these past 2 years and haven't had playoff success since that first big run that they had. So that's a name that's I don't know if he's on the hot seat, but his seat is lukewarm, I think.
I think this team just has a lack of talent that they've had in the past that, allowed them to be successful, right? Like, they have a below average quarterback at the moment, right? I'm not going to sugarcoat what Ryan Tannehill is in his current state. Derrick Henry is like 5 million years old for a running back. So is DeAndre Hopkins for a receiver. At least you would think so. Watching him, he's a lot slower than he used to be. Traylon Burks hasn't proven that he's what he was drafted to be. They don't really have an above average tight end on this roster. They have one good offensive lineman that's starting, and he's a rookie.
Yep.
You have Jeffrey Simmons, Harold Landry, um, a lot of ifs in the secondary,
I
but
think you have
nothing.
Arden Key. Did they bring in him or
Uh,
no? Was it the guy from San Francisco?
They have Danico Autry to your Tart. Their defensive line's pretty good.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I just like it. It kind of with the lack of offensive talent, right? And you did mention like their D line is pretty good. I like Harold Landry a lot more than most. I think he's a very talented pass rusher, but it's. I think there's a severe lack of playmakers on both sides of the ball, guys that can generate turnovers, right? Um, I just think this Titans team is in a spot where they have a lot of older players and guys getting up there in age, and they don't really have a lot of young guys to replace those players. So, they started it this past year when they started building from the inside out, drafting Skaronski in the first round, right? They spent a high pick on Will Levis. They still have some players defensively: Jeffrey Simmons, Landry, Byard, Tart, and Autry. So I think that it's just a spot where, when they're in the draft, they're just going to need to collect as much talent as possible, and they're in a spot where I think that the 2-4 record reflects how good they're going to be this year, right? Like, I'm just not sure they're going to get much better. How much of that reflects on Mike Vrabel, I'm not sure, because to be honest with you, like, I think a lot of his teams the past few years have overperformed to
Hmm.
expectations considering the talent around. So it's not like I would be rushing to make a decision to fire him. I think that making that AFC Championship appearance. Maybe um, got him some goodwill. Whether that runs out with how bad this team could possibly be this year, I'm not sure. But I see an overall lack of playmakers on both sides of the ball to where it would justify the coach being gone when he has overperformed with such rosters in the past.
I think that's super fair. My thought was just move it like if they're going to go in a different direction from the roster standpoint, if he was going to stick around for that. But he's definitely been an excellent coach since he's been there.
Yeah, no, he's definitely been a plus factor for that team, that locker room. I know a lot of people just want to use him as a motivator, but this is a guy that came from Bill O'Brien. Played for Bill Belichick. He understands the X's and O's, and he gets the most out of his players. He understands kind of a lot of what's one day, like Sunday in, Sunday out, is in the trenches. And when he first got there, they had a great offensive line, and they're having to retool that. And I think he'd be okay with being there for the rebuild. Now, a team that is going to be rebuilding in the future. They aren't this year, but due to cap concerns, the Cleveland Browns, right now under Jim Schwartz, look amazing, look phenomenal. We talked about it, how they held the 49ers to under 20 points. Believe it or not, every time Jim Schwartz has played up against Kyle Shanahan, the play caller, he is, I believe, 1-9 and now in those games. So they've played 10 games, and he's held Shanahan to under 20 points in each of those contests. Like, this is a guy that understands some of the higher up, like how some of these complex offenses work, and he knows how to shut them down. And he definitely deserves a lot of credit. He brought the heat this Sunday, and it's a guy we're going to keep talking about moving forward.
Yeah, that Browns unit was just unbelievable. I've talked at length about them so far. But I mean, it's just they have so much talent. He's showing so many different looks and being successful at basically all of them. Whether it's like a three safety look between those three different safeties of McLeod, Delpit, and I forget the other one, but the secondary is so good. The pass rush with Miles Garrett is so good. He's been awesome this year.
Looking back at our very first episode, Steve, we had Jim Schwartz in our top 10 additions to the division. We had him at 6. I think we undersold him. He's definitely been the best addition to this division so far to any of the teams, and he has that defense playing lights out. I know the past couple years, even dating back to when Baker was the QB, we would talk about, man, this Browns roster on paper is one of the best in the league. But each year they would underperform and wouldn't get it done. This year, with a competent coordinator in Jim Schwartz on that defensive side of the ball, they're looking like the best defense in the league.
Now, another guy, and we talked about kind of his defense at length, but Robert Saleh isn't the guy calling the plays for the New York Jets. It's their defensive coordinator, Jeff Ulbrich. And the fact that he did not have Sauce Gardner or DJ Reed and was still able to contain kind of the Eagles wide receivers, because you got to think they still have AJ Brown, Devontae Smith, Dallas Goedert. Those guys weren't out of the game. They were still in there despite the Lane Johnson injury, and they still got it done. So credits to him, credit to the scheme that they're building there. Again, that's a defense that has kind of morphed off from the Shanahan tree from Robert Saleh's time in San Francisco. So they're able to stop some of these offenses with motions and some of these decoys that they set up because they've gone against them in practice for years now.
Yeah, that Jets defense. I mean, it's amazing, right? We've talked so much about like the talent that they have, and beating the Eagles without those two elite level corners, I think is just a testament to how well run that team is. And once they do get those guys back, it's going to be so much better.
Yeah, this defense is the unit that's keeping them in games like we were talking about. They've held just excellent teams to pretty low point totals, and moving forward, they're going to be the thing that drives them to a wild card berth, or dare I say, division win.
I don't know if they're going to win the division.
Yeah,
I mean, you have the Bills and the Dolphins. I think if they can get into the wild card, that will be impressive, especially with like a stacked AFC. They're going to be contending with like the Pittsburgh Steelers for like that 6-7 spot.
just in time for Rodgers to come back from his Achilles.
Very true. Now, another guy we talked about, Mike Caldwell last week, and he's kind of that. really nobody knows about him, defensive play caller, and he's been tearing it up down in Jacksonville. But another guy that I think deserves a lot of credit is Aaron Glenn with the Detroit Lions. I mean, this guy has been huge in Aiden Hutchinson's development, who spent time with Dwight Freeney this offseason to kind of offset his smaller arms. It's one thing that you had a knock on Hutchinson coming out of the draft was his shorter arms and his ability to kind of get after the quarterback. And he hasn't been stood up nearly as much by tackles this year because he understands how to use his leverage, how to get around tackles when he kind of gets close to their chest, and it forced tackles to punch and kick out more and not let him come into their body. And it changes the complexity of that defensive line. He can line up as a 3 tech, a 9 tech, some of the pieces they've added on that defensive line. This was a big question mark we had about the Detroit Lions coming into the season, and it appears to be one of their biggest strengths. Tie that to the fact that they have Cam Sutton playing really well on the back end. Brian Branch, their rookie, has looked really good. This is just a complete unit, and it looks like a dominant force in the NFC.
I saw a tweet after we played the Lions that Aiden Hutchinson rushes the passer like Waluigi, and
Yeah.
I saw that clip like everywhere. I think like Sports Center or something posted it on Instagram afterwards. It's just that's all I think about when I think of Aiden Hutchinson now. But he's awesome. He's been so good. You mentioned Brian Branch. I think he was one of the more underrated prospects coming into the draft this past year, and he's kind of proven it when he's been on the field. He's been like an awesome playmaker for the Lions. So they're a defense that has a lot of different interesting players, like you mentioned, Cam Sutton. I like Kirby Joseph. Charles Harris kind of has had a career resurgence in Detroit. Jack Campbell looks like a rookie linebacker so far.
He's had a couple
Alex
glimpses.
Anzalone, he has. I was very concerned when they drafted him in the first round about his ability to be like a pass coverage kind
Yep.
of guy, and I think a lot of those concerns have kind of carried over so far this year. But in terms of being like a run stopping linebacker, I think he's been like very good at like filling gaps, meeting guys. I think that he will be like a good starting linebacker going forward. I'm just a little bit hesitant about his ability in coverage. Um, Aiden Hutchinson, though, I think that's he's going to be the star of this defense going forward. I mean, every team wants like an elite young pass rusher that they can sort of build around, and the Lions are just so lucky that the Jaguars did not select him first overall and instead went with Trayvon Walker.
Yeah, I think going into the year, we even talked about this last week. The defense is what we had concerns with, particularly in the run game, Steve. And the way they've been able to do this, despite all their injuries, being a suffocating run defense, a defense that gets after the quarterback with, aside from Hutchinson, not a ton of big name players, and just shuts them down in the back end with the pass game. It's been phenomenal, and I think Aaron Glenn is a huge reason for that.
Now we're on to one of our final sections, and that's the MVP watch. Me and Jacob have a disagreement on who is number one. I'll let Jacob go first and make his case for why he believes player X is one, and then I will list my reasons why player Y should be one. So kick it off for us, Jacob. If you have any input, Dylan, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, they're neck and neck to me. And these are guys that we talked about last week. I have Tua Tagovailoa as number one right now. Just the engine behind a 5-1 team. He leads the league. I believe he's tied for the league lead in passing touchdowns. Leads the league in yards. He's just playing lights out this year. He's just keeping the Dolphins going. I know they do have kind of an easy mode scheme, and they do have really good playmakers. But they had that scheme and some of those playmakers last year, and I think Tua's just stepped it up a level and really has the offense functioning at a high level en route to a 5-1 first 6 game stretch.
So I think Tua definitely deserves to be in the conversation. I think he is top three, top two, probably top two. But I think the guy that needs to be at number one is Josh Allen. He leads the league in total EPA, and EPA is expected points added. So that's accounting for down distance, time to go, when we're factoring in what does this yard gain looks like from a points perspective. And that's what matters. Who scores the most points at the end of the day is going to win the game. So he leads in that regard. He's also one of the best red zone passers. And a lot of offenses are having struggles in the red zone, and the ability to punch it in when it matters is a huge skill. And I think that's one thing that if he can carry the Bills to the number one seed in the AFC, he is going to put himself in a position where I think he's the MVP frontrunner.
You both make very valid points. If I had to choose between those two players, I think right now I would lean Josh Allen because I think he's doing a little bit more with slightly less weapons. But I want to make the point here that I think Tyreek Hill is a player that's kind of underrated in this conversation, right? Like he's putting up just unreal numbers, right? As of right now, if he continues on this 17 game pace, which again that's asking a lot, right? He would finish with over 2,300 yards, which is just an absurd number on about 120 receptions and 17 touchdowns,
That's
right?
gaudy.
And I think my point here is if a wide receiver does that in the current NFL and does not win MVP, I don't think a receiver would ever win MVP, right? And he's doing that, right? So I saw a tweet today that said, yards per route run in non-garbage time, which is defined by a win percentage of 10% to 90%. Tyreek Hill is averaging 6 yards per route run. Second is Stephon Diggs with 3.1 yards per route run. So almost double,
Wow.
right? There have been 14 games this year where a wide receiver has 150 plus receiving yards. Tyreek Hill has 4 of those 14 games.
I
So I
believe it.
think I think I know you guys like McCaffrey a lot in this conversation as well, but considering like the Mike McDaniel system, considering those that 17 game projection right now for Tyreek Hill, as well as just the pure production, right? Yards per route run, more than double any other player in the NFL. I think that he's really being underrated in this conversation. And I mean, if it comes to week 18 and he has like 22-5, 2250,
Mm-hmm.
and like 15 or more touchdowns, it's going to be really hard to vote against that. Considering we've never seen wide receiver numbers like even close to that.
No, if he breaks 2K and he breaks 2K by that margin, like you're saying that 2,200 range, and he does it like you're saying on like 120 receptions, like yes, he absolutely deserves all of the accreditation in terms of like MVP votes and consideration. I wonder if he's going to get the Justin Jefferson treatment from last year, and I think it was the Cooper Cup from the year before, and it's you get Offensive Player of the Year. Like that's the compensation. Like MVP is held for the quarterback position, but I, all the points that you listed out, I think Tyreek Hill deserves to be in this conversation, and it's for a lot of the same reasons as the guy on our list at number 3, Christian McCaffrey. It's everything runs through this guy and what he's able to do, and if the stats keep up the way they're on pace to, there's no reason he shouldn't be.
Right. We talked about last week when they acquired McCaffrey, they were undefeated except for the NFC Championship game. Well, he gets hurt in this game and they lose the game. Now, I'm not saying that's correlated, but he's certainly super important to this San Francisco 49ers offense. He is the engine that it runs through. I know Purdy is playing a bit better than what he did last year, but McCaffrey's the one who sets it up with all the motion, all the stuff out of the backfield he can do. Like Tage said last week, he's not a running back. He's just truly a weapon. He's one of those few guys where people are like, oh, this running back can run routes out of the backfield. Well, McCaffrey can actually line up and run routes better than receivers can. He's a true weapon, and glad to see him thriving. This is a lot of the same stuff I said last week, but hopefully he's able to get back better after or come back after that oblique injury and keep performing at this high level because it's going to be stuff like LaDainian Tomlinson did back in the day, like Adrian Peterson did if he keeps up his pace.
I really don't want to live in the universe where the Panthers give up the NFL MVP and the number one overall pick in the span of 19 months, something like that. That would really be pretty depressing.
That's our life as Panther fans these days, and I'm glad that we're able to this week to just take a breather and enjoy the rest of the NFL games and not have to worry about another loss. But that being said, because we're kind of in this almost like we're getting close to about the halfway point in the season, I think it's fair to start handing out grades and assessments, both from a front office and coaching standpoint, but also a player evaluation. How have some of these players that we have paid or invested high draft capital in, how have they performed up to this point in the season? Jacob, what do you think? What do you want to kick off first? I'll let you kind of take this away.
Every week we talk about, and some of it fairly, some of it unfairly, mostly fairly, about how the coaching staff and the performance from the coaching rooms is just below par. We heard all off season from not only fans but from like news pundits like Ian Rappaport how this is a superstar coaching staff, one of the best coaching staffs we've ever seen. And so with that in mind, I'm thinking, man, we should have good game plans. We should be able to manage the game well. We'll have a stronger analytics staff. I know they brought in a couple people for the analytics room, and so far it's just all been pretty horrendous. I like maybe an F is harsh, like if we're looking at a letter grade scale, but I think they've failed in a lot of the facets of the game so far. Game management, just wasting timeouts, getting times before the half where we can drive down and try and get a touchdown, and we just waste time and play for the field goal. Happened this week, by the way, against the Dolphins, and Panera missing. I'm just going to chalk that up to karma for letting time tick off and not go for the touchdown. But in my opinion, I know we're only 6 weeks in, and I don't want to be too hard because I've been hard every other podcast. But I think the coaching staff has been a letdown so far.
I think anytime you're 0-6 through 6 weeks is going to be an F grade.
Yeah,
I
I
think
mean,
it's pretty self-explanatory. This team we were told would be one that would, if not make the playoffs in a weak division, at least compete for a playoff spot. And this team is 0-2 against division opponents and 0-6 through 6 weeks, having lost by a combined, I'm not going to do the math, but a lot of points the last 2 weeks. So um, it's really disappointing, especially when it's the first offensive minded head coach that this team has ever had, right? And you struggle so much offensively, whether it's the play calling, whether it's receivers failing to get separation, whether it's the offensive line regressing as much as it has. And a lot of that has been because of the personnel, right? But at the end of the day, this team was, it won 6-7 games last year. You change the coach, you add the first overall pick at quarterback. It doesn't matter what else changes. You expect to get better, right? So for this team to be winless through 6 weeks is almost inexcusable, right?
it is. And I think what's alarming is the fact that we're not playing towards our strengths. We had like 5 tight ends rostered on our final 53. We knew our wide receiver room wasn't our strong point, and we've had 3 or more wide receivers on the field for 90% of our offensive plays. And Reich had more of a background using 12 personnel in Indianapolis prior to coming here. So why aren't we having Tommy Tremble and Hayden Hurst on the field together with a Mingo, so we have extra big bodies not only in the run game but pass protection, so we can have 6, 7, 8 man protections on some of these Bryce Young dropbacks? Because what I hate to see, especially when we have the number 1 overall pick and it's a smaller dude, is that he's getting beat up behind a porous offensive line. And I don't know what line of thinking the offensive coaches go and go, oh, yeah, 5-man protections. Like, it's clearly working. Let's keep doing it. And they just keep doing it. And it's very frustrating. I'm hoping when Thomas Brown comes out of the bye, we're seeing more play action. We're seeing a lot more motion. There's a lot more deception to cause the defense to hesitate just for a little bit to give Bryce some time, because these aren't world beaters in the wide receiver room. Adam Thielen being our best wide receiver is not necessarily like a job well done by the front office. This is something where like the offensive coaches need to realize there are deficiencies in your personnel and how to combat that, and that's not been done.
I think a thing that's being overlooked too is the defensive side of the ball. We had pretty, I would say, average to maybe slightly above average personnel coming into this year, and we added Ejiro Evero as the new coordinator, and the defense just hasn't been up to par either. I know we talked about the injuries and stuff like that, but really disheartening to see on that side of the ball. And then, unless anybody has any more bars for the coaching staff, we can move on to the front office, which I don't think it'll be any different. The grade.
It's
Yeah.
shocking that we've traded. I think it's I've seen some of the tweets, but it's like almost like 8 or 10 picks for like the various quarterbacks over the years. Like we trade for Darnold, we trade for Mayfield, we trade up and draft Matt Corral, then we trade up a whole bunch of picks to go grab Bryce Young, and it's just we throw so many darts at the ball, and then like you guys alluded to earlier, we haven't hit on the other picks that we've taken. Like this is not a roster full of talent from the draft, and free agency you can only do so much. And so like at the end of the day, Fitterer needs to be held responsible, and I don't see him lasting past this season.
So I have a before I talk about Scott Fitter, I have a question for you too. Am I allowed to swear here on this podcast?
Yes,
Yeah,
we're gonna
we'll throw
check a
the
little
E tag
box.
on.
You drop whatever word you want to, as long as it's not a racial slur.
Okay, that will not be an issue for me. So I'm in this group chat with a bunch of other Panthers fans, and our nickname for Scott Fitterer has become Shitterer.
There we
He's
go. That's good.
there we go. It's he's look. At the end of the day, we talked about it earlier. You build your team through the draft, and you supplement that through adding pieces via trade or free agency, but you never want those pieces to be your cornerstones. You want your cornerstones to come through the draft. At the end of the day, the 2021 NFL draft, you had 11 picks. Um, you draft J.C. Horn in the first round, right? We talked about the misses and who they did not select, right? Like everybody likes to talk about us passing on Justin Fields in that draft, or at least the past few years, it's been kind of the narrative. But the two picks after Surtain, Devontae Smith, the two picks after Fields were Parsons and Slater. All of those guys we could have used, right? And if you look at like the top 13 picks in that draft, like J.C. Horn is probably one of the worst non-quarterbacks taken. Um, if you look at the 2022 NFL draft, right? Iquanu has not performed this season, at least, up to standard, and neither has Evan Neal. I would say Icky has been much better than Evan Neal throughout their young careers so far. Um, but Charles Cross has looked like a franchise left tackle as well.
Hmm.
Garrett Wilson won Rookie of the Year, right? And he looks every bit of an elite receiver. It's easy to do kind of like the revisionist history sort of thing, especially with the first round picks. But if you look at just even this year, right? Like you trade up for a defensive lineman in the third round who's not projected to go into like the fifth round, right?
Hmm.
And DJ Johnson, he's like not even played a snap, right? He's been
He looks awful
horrendous.
in
We haven't
practice. Like
we
you
haven't
see
heard
some
from
of the
him.
practice videos, and he can't beat a backup like offensive tackle. Like what?
He looks very bad, right? And granted, you never know with these draft guys, like they could be developmental. And I don't know if even that could be an excuse for a player who's 25 years old, right?
Hmm.
I think it's too early to judge Jonathan Mingo, but the Panthers did also pass on a guy like Tank Dell, who's been awesome in Houston so far. Last year, they trade up for Matt Corral in what's kind of like a panic move because they didn't want to trade for Baker yet, I guess. And then they draft Brandon Smith, a linebacker in the fourth round, who was cut this year, right? The other three picks that they had are not good. If you look at 2021 again, Terrace Marshall, not good. Brady Christensen is probably like the only average starter I would say I'm comfortable saying he's an average starter outside of like Bryce Young so far.
Yeah.
Tommy Tremble, not good for a third round pick. Chuba Hubbard, he's good for a fourth rounder, right? Um, outside of that, like this, it's quite frankly inexcusable to have three different drafts with 20 plus players, and none of them are above average.
I
Yeah, I
am
mean the
so glad
only
you brought up DJ Johnson because looking at my draft board here, he was the lowest person that I had graded to go on day 2, and we took him at 80. I had him at 166 out of 199, and we took him at 80. We traded up to get him, and the two guys that we ended up or they ended up drafting, Darnell Washington. He hasn't done too much, but he's been a solid blocker, and Nick Herbig out of Wisconsin, been a pretty good pass rusher so far.
Yeah, I mean, when your offense needs playmakers, right? Two of the five picks that go after you, and I know it's like a running back, right? But Tyjae Spears, the pick after
Hmm.
DJ Johnson, Devon A. Chain, like five picks
Mhm.
after, right? So when you need like playmakers all over the offense, and you're trading like multiple solid picks up to get a player like DJ Johnson, it's like it's moves like that that won't get a lot of coverage that really hurt your team building, because you're getting two potential rotation guys at the very minimum, right? And you're trading them for a 25-year-old edge rusher who should not have gone where he went.
He
It's just like the simple stuff like that.
he started as a tight end too at Oregon.
Yeah, he's I I like to think of myself as somebody that like does like a lot of draft research every year. I never thought that DJ Johnson, he simply was not on my radar to go that high. Like even close to the 80th overall pick.
Yeah, he was in UDFA territory for me.
And
But
It was bad.
yeah,
it's like
and when let me just real quick. Fitterer explained it when he explained the move. I remember in one of his pressers that they thought an edge rusher run was about to start going, so they wanted to jump ahead and get a guy there. That's not really a good reason to waste your picks there, especially when we're still a team that clearly isn't going to be competitive. But maybe he thought that we were going to be competitive because that was the message he was peddling all offseason, like you guys were saying, that we should drop this QB in and make a run at the NFC South.
I mean, you look at some of the players that we could have taken with that later pick, right? Siaki Ika, who's been pretty good for Cleveland this year, right? Like Kaylee Ringo, who, granted, hasn't been in the rotation for Philly, but with a team that needs corner depth so desperately, he could have been a player that had an impact for the Panthers this year, right? Like Clark Phillips is another guy. There's so many guys like up and down the board that you can point to, and say that they would have an impact. And I know it's revisionist history. I keep saying that, but at the end of the day, like your job as a general manager is to go and draft the right players for the team. You're supposed to build up, your team, your depth, and hopefully starters for a long term future. Right. That's why rookie contracts are so valuable. And when you trade up, for a player like DJ Johnson, you're giving up one of those rookie contracts, for your team that's going to help, your team building, right? Like the past 2 years, you've had a combined 11 picks, in the past two drafts, and that's just not a winning formula, right? You need an abundance of young, cheap talent if you want to sustain winning. And we saw that in 2021 where they kept trading down, and it almost became like a joke, right? But they made these like high value trades, and it was good process. A lot of the players haven't worked out, but it was good process at the time. So I'm just Scott Schitterer, I like to say. Um, I don't think he has too much longer. I think he might even be gone after the trade deadline, depending on what happens there. But there's been almost no single move of his other than the first overall pick trade that he can really hang his hat on and say that it was a net positive for the team.
Yeah. I mean, you listed off, you went through the entire draft classes, and the guys that I think you can list off as like anybody quality. It's J.C. Horn, Brady Christensen, maybe Chuba Hubbard, and then obviously Bryce Young. And then you go beyond that. And for me, your job as a front office is talent evaluation and make sure you get your guy without reaching for him. And throughout this entire draft process, it sounded like the team and the coaches were all the ones putting input on who they were taking. Like Chandler Savala, buddies with Ike Ekwonu, has looked like a bust. I mean, he's a rookie. Granted, he probably shouldn't have been thrown into the fire this early, especially when we had Corbett and Brady Christensen. But it's one of those things. He doesn't look great. DJ Johnson, that's the guy Evero wanted. They were so happy when they got him. And exactly like what we've talked about, massive reach. And then when come day 2, after we get our quarterback, we call up Steve Smith and we go, okay, so what wide receiver are you taking? And at no point do I have an issue with, okay, let's talk to people, let's get an idea of their opinions of, but it sounds like there's very much a lot of influence outside of the front office in making these picks and making these decisions. And I think that's just poor process.
And
And like, go for it, Jacob.
oh yeah, another thing is the free agent signings that Fitterer has made. I know you have a lot of issue with some of the free agent signings over the past couple off seasons, Steve.
I mean, so the big one is, and it's obvious. We talked about it briefly earlier, but Dante Jackson. It was the year Deshaun Watson
Horrible.
was available for trade, and we were trying to finagle things so we weren't going to keep Reddick and Gilmore. And I told Jacob, like, I can put messages up of us having conversations back and forth. We should have kept Reddick and Gilmore and let Dante walk. And we should have never gotten in the Watson sweepstakes. And if you think about that, if those two pieces are on our defense right now, it's a different ball game. We can lean on our defense and just play ball control on offense. We don't need any pizzazz. And unfortunately, because we don't have that talent in the cupboard anymore, now it's our defense is stretched with injuries. Our offense doesn't look good because we got a rookie quarterback behind a porous offensive line and wide receivers who can't get separation. And it's just all these problems start compounding on one another to now we're 0-6. And like Dylan said, we were a 6-7 win team last year. The expectation is when you plug a quarterback into this roster that you put yourself in a position where you're winning more games, not less. And we're going backwards for no reason.
Yeah,
You look at a lot of the free agency signings that they made, especially this offseason. Adam Thielen, like sure, you're gonna need to surround your quarterback with weapons. DJ Chark is the same reasoning. Um, Hayden Hurst has kind of like disappeared almost. Like he had a really good week 1. I feel like I've heard his name like 4 times since that moment.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at like Shy Tuttle, 3 years, $20 million. I considering how bad this interior defensive line is, I don't really think that signing has been super justified. Miles Sanders is the extremely obvious one here.
hmm
He's looked downright terrible, and I know that you can excuse a lot of that with injury, um, but even so, like a lot of that comes with the territory of paying a running back is that the injury risk of those guys is greater than others. So especially a 4-year contract where a lot of that money is guaranteed. That's just it was a bad contract at the time. It was the highest pay that any free agent running back got this offseason. And it continues to look like an even worse deal as the weeks go by and as Chuba Hubbard in particular looks better and better. You mentioned the Dante Jackson deal. I've never been a huge fan of Dante Jackson. His rookie year, he was pretty exciting to watch, right?
He showed
Um,
flashes, and that's
he
what you're supposed to
showed,
do as a
yeah,
rookie.
he showed flashes, right? And ever since that point, it's been like ankle injury after shin injury after 50-yard touchdown after another injury. And it's almost like he has like how people on Twitter will like design like a cycle for each
hmm
player. Like you remember like the Ryan Fitzpatrick cycle. It's almost like Dante Jackson has his own where it's like instead of like a big elaborate one, it goes from injury to blown coverage back to injury again. And it's getting to the point where you invest $30 million over 3 years, if not more money, right? I think it was higher than that, into a player that you would expect to be a starter. And even at the time, it looked like a shaky contract Meanwhile, Hassan Reddick got $15 million a year, if I'm not mistaken, which
Yep.
isn't too much more. Um, the allocation of resources is something that has not been right, in any free agency that Scott Fitterer has been a part of, and it really showed in that particular offseason, and it showed with some of the contracts he handed out this offseason, even if it was under the guise of making things easier for a rookie quarterback.
And all those contracts he handed out, he didn't extend Brian Burns, homegrown talent who we decided not to trade on multiple occasions because he was part of the future.
Absolutely. I think we can all give Scott Schitterer a resounding F here, along with the rest of the front office. They haven't we know we're supposed to have a superstar front office too with Dan Morgan and Samir Suleiman. I think I'm saying that correctly, but nothing's really panned out during the tenure there. As far as the players go, I don't want to put all the onus on the players because obviously there's dysfunction everywhere throughout the organization, but I think there's been some clear regression from important players like Ike Ekwonu and Dante Jackson and even Burns to a degree. He's had still a phenomenal year, but it seems like he kind of tapers off for portions of games. I think the only really positive new addition, other than I think Bryce is still inconclusive, like we said, it has been Adam Thielen. He's played above the level, well, to the level of his contract, above his expectations. But as far as the players go, I think as a whole it's been inconclusive so far. But hopefully we can tune that up a bit. What I wanted to ask you guys about is like the outlook for the rest of the season, particularly the next couple weeks. Like we're going into a bye week this week. It's a good time to self scout, like Frank Reich said. Good time to eval. Do you think we're going to be fire salesmen here at the deadline?
I'm to the point where I really love Brian Burns, right? He's, in my opinion, been the best Panther the past like 3 or so years. Each and every year, he's been the best player on the field for our team, other than maybe like McCaffrey before he was traded. I think that I'm to the point where if there is an offer where you could get like 2 first round picks like there was in the past, I think that's an offer you would probably have to take at this point, considering the lack of resources that you have in building a functional offense, and that you never want to give away like a 25, 26 year old elite level pass rusher. But when you don't have the resources to build a team, the lack of resources that the Panthers do, no first round pick this year, um, nobody's going to let their wide receiver just walk into free agency when your best chance at getting like a guy like that is going to be with a second round pick, early second. It's going to be so hard, right? So if you could get 2 first round picks for Brian Burns, I think that's a deal that you would have to consider heavily. It would depend upon the team that's trading for him whether I would do it. Like if it's like a team that like the Eagles, where it's going to be like the 31st overall pick for the next 2 years, then maybe it's going to be harder to justify. But if it's a team like the Rams, who are going to have a mid first, then that's something I would probably do, right? And that's the same way for Derek Brown. Maybe not 2 first rounders, but if the right deal came along, I would definitely consider doing so. And for J.C. Horn as well. I think the thing for me is like, if there's a player that a team is interested in trading for that isn't one of the 2 offensive tackles or Bryce Young, I'm listening to the offer at the very least.
Yeah. No, you got to recoup something, especially when you're going to have to pivot towards the future. So it's one of those things. Okay, can we send one of these guys that we would have to pay and either get a couple picks, or maybe we get a player or two? Because I know there's been talks that we go out and we get like this true number one wide receiver. I don't know exactly what the front office means by that, but it's one of those things that if you can pivot with some of the pieces you already have without having to give up more draft capital, I think that would be very beneficial.
The most depressing thing about a Burns trade would be that we'd be trading first round picks in back to back to back years with McCaffrey, DJ Moore, and Brian Burns. But I think for the future, if you can get a good offer, to maybe to that maybe below that Rams level. I doubt we're gonna get 2 ones and a 2 again now that teams know that we're not looking to pay Brian Burns. But hopefully we can get something at the deadline and maybe not give up so many resources. I know we've been linked to like Jerry Judy and I believe Marquise Brown was another name that was thrown out there. Hopefully they wouldn't cost too much, but if Scott Fitterer's making the picks next year, go ahead and trade the picks because he's not hitting on them. And then another thing I wanted to ask you guys was Thomas Brown is the new play caller. Do you guys think the offense will improve at all with if he looks to incorporate more McVay style motion and not personnel diversity, but player diversity within the personnel?
So I think it's going to start with, especially when you see McVay and kind of the prodigies from his tree. If you're looking at it like a Kevin O'Connell, a Zach Taylor, and now like a Thomas Brown, is that within their offenses they have like a true number one. In Cincinnati, you have Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, and obviously T Higgins is there as well. And Minnesota, it was Kirk Cousins and Justin Jefferson. And it seems with the Rams, Matthew Stafford, Cooper Cup. It seems with Carolina, it seems like it's Bryce Young and Adam Thielen right now. So you want to be able to spam that. You want to be able to scheme things up to where Thielen is running wide open. But what we also see this past year is that Tutu Atwell, Puka Nakua, they're getting open all over in different roles, different routes around the field. And that Seahawks, that big touchdown we had, the DJ Chark, was something that Thomas Brown schemed up when he saw what the Seattle defense was doing on the back end. So what I'm hoping is that he's able to bring is some of these different route combinations, and he's able to expose weaknesses and give Bryce a few layups within that offensive structure, because that seems to not be the case in Frank Reich's play calling. There aren't a lot of easy buttons, and everything seems really earned and almost forced.
Yeah, I'll leave the play calling to Steven here. I want to see improvement. When you have a lack of weapons that the Panthers do, and an offensive line that looks like it is clearly regressed and has the offensive guards of like a college team, it's there's only so much that you can do. I'm hoping that we can make things simple and easy and scheme guys open. I would love to see more involvement from Jonathan Mingo, but from what I have seen, he hasn't looked too amazing so far. I know he's a little bit more on the raw side, but the fact that they do trust him to get as many snaps as he is getting already is something that I think is good. It's just the fact that he's still one to he's going to need to put it together more.
Absolutely. Going into one of our last segments is like our future Panthers segment, going over the college players from this past week. I know, Dylan, you messaged me. You wanted to talk a lot about this. I'll let you take the floor here.
Yeah, maybe not necessarily future Panthers, but I did. I think everybody's always obsessed with the quarterbacks of any given draft class, and this year there's like two really elite guys, Drake May and Caleb Williams, and I guess so far, like my hot take that I think my biggest hot take, I guess, compared to traditional NFL media is that I have Drake May slightly higher than Caleb Williams, and I think they're both going to be just amazing prospects. And I was listening to the Athletic Show with Nate Tice earlier this week, and he kind of mentioned that he had those two guys almost even now. But Drake May is just like somebody who's 6'5", making every throw on the money. And Tez Walker, by the way, looked amazing for UNC. And I think his first or second game, I can't remember which game
It
he
was
came
a
back,
second
but
game. Second game.
yeah, he looked just phenomenal, like almost like a day two, day one pick. I'm not sure if he'll be able to sustain it, but he looked amazing. But I think my main gripe with Caleb Williams is, a lot of these like high level throws that he's making are almost a product of his own creation, in the sense that he's waiting in the pocket for like 4, 5, 6 seconds,
Mm-hmm.
and he's able to beat defenders just with his pure athleticism, right? And it's amazing to see at the college level, right? But it almost reminds me of when like Justin Fields, for instance, was at Ohio State, right? And he was waiting to get the ball out because he had amazing receivers that and an amazing offensive line. So he could wait and he could use his athleticism to extend the play. And when he gets to the NFL, it's a lot harder to I guess speed up the game for him, right? And I get the same vibes with Caleb Williams, and that's not to say that he can't do it. It's just a matter of he's not doing it right now, right? Meanwhile, Drake May is like, he's anticipating throws more. I think he's shown a little bit more like downfield anticipation, and just like pure pocket awareness, right? I think that, if I had to choose today, I think Drake May is the one that I would pick first overall.
I couldn't agree with you more there. I think Drake May, in terms of a prospect, reminds me a lot of Justin Herbert. I think he has that build, that arm to throw downfield, and makes a lot of the downfield touch throws that Herbert's able to make. Meanwhile, Caleb Williams, well, he's also excellent, Heisman winner, great athlete, great quarterback, as we've seen. A lot of the plays, like we're talking about, these super plays where he's evading rushers and stuff, are of his own design. A lot of the highlights that are shown where he's 6 or 7 seconds in the pocket, escaping pressure and hitting the open guy on the scramble. If you look at those highlights and take them from the snap, he'll have people open for first downs. He can just move the chains, but a lot of times he'll just move behind the pocket looking for that scramble throw. Reminds me a bit of early Russell Wilson, who would run behind the pocket a lot, looking to work those scramble drills with Doug Baldwin and other receivers like that. Super successful, but a lot of the times it's just not super necessary. I also have Drake May currently ahead of Caleb Williams. For me, it's a bit more not they're not in separate tiers, but I have a more of a distinct difference between the two. Like I would definitely say I'd be willing to say that I would definitely have Drake May ahead of him at this point.
I think a lot of it, like when the draft comes around, is going to depend on what team gets that first
Hmm.
overall pick, right? Like, I'm trying to think of like an example, but I would assume that like if it's a coach that would want a little bit more structure, right? Like maybe it's like a double, and he prefers like Caleb Williams because he's had Josh Allen in the past, right? Or maybe it's like a Minnesota Vikings team, which I would doubt at this point since they have 2 wins. But if it's like the Vikings, then maybe they prefer like a Drake May type. So I think a lot of it's going to depend on what team ends up with the first overall pick in terms of who ends up being that guy. But it might end up being like a pick your flavor type of pick.
Absolutely. They'll both still go 1 and 2, regardless of who has what picks. They're both going to end up being the first two. And then a guy who really, I think, cemented his spot in QB3 for the rest of the year this past week was Michael Penix Jr. in the Oregon Washington rivalry game. It was like an offensive shootout for most of the game, and to drive down with less than 2 minutes left, not clocking the ball, not trying to run to like run the clock down, but hitting Roma Dunze on that down the left sideline, that jump ball touchdown. It was just really good. It showed what he needed to show. I know early in his career at Indiana, dealt with injury, wasn't the best there, but he's another example of like Joe Burrow, a successful transfer story where an older QB is able to play with a maybe a better talent around him, but really, really perform. And I think what he's doing is really pushing him to be the next QB off the board that's taken in the first round.
I think I'm impressed by Michael Penix, right? I really like his receivers a lot, all three of
Yeah,
them, particularly Adunze. I think he's going to end up being a top 10 pick. Like he has size, he has speed, he's got route running. I think he's going to be an amazing NFL receiver, and he's shown it all really so far in this draft. And for a lot of this year, I've kind of considered the two Ohio State guys the wide receiver one and wide receiver two, but Adunze is kind of getting too good to ignore almost, right? And he has kind of played himself into like that top 10 pick status.
absolutely. Right here, I wrote he was the star of the wide receiver off this past week with him and McMillan and Polk and Troy Franklin for Oregon. But I was actually talking with Steve before we recorded about how highly I have Odunze regarded. He's definitely playing himself into first round territory between him and Keon Coleman And Amika Egbuka has kind of fallen off. He's also dealt with a lot of injury this year. But the race for wide receiver 2 this year is going to be just incredible. We have a ton of receivers that could be first round receivers in a lot of other classes, but that are going to be pushed down. Like Troy Franklin could be a fringe first rounder. Tez Walker, like you're saying, if he sustains his play. Johnny Wilson for FSU, like if he learned how to catch, he'd be a top 10 pick because he's like 6'7", 230, and probably is running a 4.4. Just a ton of incredible receivers. We even talked about this with Tage last week on the pod. We were all fawning over how many good receivers there are in this class, but it's a good thing for the Panthers to need a receiver because there's going to be one there at 33 or wherever we pick.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of like the importance of if you could get like a first round pick for a guy like Bryce or for a guy like Burns, right? And you
Mhm.
could end up with a guy like Neighbors or Coleman or Dunze. Maybe a guy like Johnny Wilson ends up kind of climbing his way into that
Or
first
the
round
two Texas
category, right?
guys too are going to be
Yeah,
there as well.
yeah. Xavier Worthy can take the top off of a defense, right? So
Mhm.
there's so many different guys, and even if you get a pick and it's like in that range where Brock Bowers is there, like he would be hard to pass on too, even though he may not have that wide receiver outside impact that you would want. He would be an awesome pass catcher to add as well. So there's just so many different guys in this year's class where there's amazing quarterbacks, there's amazing receivers, there's a very good tight end, and even on the offensive line side of things, like Joe Alt is one of my favorite offensive linemen that I've kind of watched so far, and Fashanu from Penn State as well has been very good.
Yeah, this is definitely the year to need to draft offensive players. I think as it stands, I have about 320 something guys that are on my list right now. Over 180 of them are on the offensive side. So definitely an offensive draft here.
Which, like you guys alluded to, we're going to need a lot of. We're probably going to need a wide receiver in the second. If we're somehow able to flip a player for a first or a couple later picks, we'll probably throw another dart on the offensive side there. Definitely try to shore up the offensive line. That's definitely a problem. But as we're wrapping up this episode, it's a little bit lengthier one. This isn't our longest episode, but it's approaching that. We'll wrap up with our perfect takes. And this is kind of like the one take we have going into the week, see what comes of it. I said that the Browns would kind of hold the San Francisco 49ers under 25 points last week. Jacob, what was your take last week?
I don't even remember, it was something. No, I said the Bears would beat the Vikings without Jefferson, and obviously that one turned out to be incorrect.
The Fields injury was unfortunate, but since you are a guest, Dylan, what is your take and what do you expect this coming Sunday?
The Chargers keep finding ways to lose by a field goal, right? Like they lost by 2 points to the Dolphins. They lost by a field goal to the Charger or to the Titans. They lost by a field goal to the Cowboys. And I think this year or this week they're going to turn it around. I think they will beat the Kansas City Chiefs, who have been kind of lackluster their past few weeks. And I think Herbert is going to end up throwing 4 touchdowns or so, two of those to Keenan Allen, hopefully for my fantasy team. And I think the Chargers get back to 500.
I like that one. I do think the Chiefs' defense is a bit. It's a force to be reckoned with. So I'm not sure about the 4 touchdowns there from Herbert, but maybe they can get a win there. My take is that coming off the bye week, Jordan Love, who has had a pretty rough start to the season, I think he's going to get right against one of the worst defenses in the league this week, and I think the Packers are going to beat the Broncos.
Me and Jacob had a interesting discourse on that take. I have Jordan Love on my fantasy team, and I feel like this is going to be the week he actually drops the eight ball or drops the ball again, and Jordan Love looks kind of like the rookie-ish quarterback, first year starter that he has been up to this point. But I am hoping in the case, like you're saying, Jacob, he comes out, he balls, and he corrects the ship. My take is that it's another team. It's not just a player; it's a team that kind of corrects ship after a poor showing on Sunday Night Football, kind of taking it down to the wire against the New York Giants. I feel like the Bills get right in Foxborough, dropping a 40 piece while keeping the Patriots offense out of the end zone. So they'll just allow field goals. Maybe the Pats defense will luck into a defensive turnover late against like a backup quarterback like the Panthers did versus the Dolphins. But that's all our takes. Do we have anything else we want to add before we sign off?
As an honest Mac Jones hater, I would love nothing more than your take to be true.
Well, there we go. I think we have ties with fantasy implications on all of these perfect takes. So I think a perfect week would be if all of them came true. Dylan, thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to talk ball with us. I know it's been an unfortunate season so far, but I think we learned a lot and enjoyed what you had to bring today.
Appreciate it. Yeah, I'm so glad I did not spend the money on season tickets this year. So
There we go. There's always next year. So with that, we'll catch you guys next week.